Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Dar's Nights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable and begin. Story 1. When Jason bought a cheap car at a police auction, he thought he'd found the deal of a lifetime. But the smell wouldn't go away. The trunk wouldn't open. And every night at exactly 2:13 a.m., something started banging from the inside. What he didn't know was that this car had a past soaked in blood, and its last victim might still be screaming for help. Or worse, something that used to be alive is still trying to get out. This is not just a story, it's a warning. A warning to never ignore what's been locked away too long. Jason never believed in bad luck. He believed in numbers, practicality, and taking advantage of opportunities most people overlooked. So when he saw the online listing for a police auction 2 towns over, he didn't hesitate. Old impounded vehicles, some barely running, others just needing a little work, perfect for someone with a mechanical mind and a tight wallet. He had just enough savings to cover a down payment on rent, but instead, he took a chance on transportation. The bus ride out there was long and quiet, broken only by the static murmur of true crime podcasts playing through his earbuds. The auction yard was colder than he expected. Rows of dented sedans, forgotten pickup trucks, and soulless vans sat lined up behind barbed wire fencing. They all had tags hanging from rearview mirrors, their lot numbers fading in the sunlight. Most people were there for parts or resale. Jason was there for something he could drive to class. The 2009 black Mercury Sable didn't stand out much. It was dusty, had a cracked rear taillight, and smelled faintly of mildew when he leaned in to inspect the interior. But the tires were decent, and the engine, when briefly turned on by the officer handling the keys, purred just enough to feel reassuring. No one else bid on it. Jason won it for under $2,000. It was only when he sat inside for the first time that the smell hit him harder. Something sour, like rotten leather or meat left too long in a sealed room. He rolled down the windows and told himself it just needed a good cleaning. Nothing unusual for a car that had been sitting for months. Maybe someone had left groceries in it before it was impounded. Maybe a small animal had gotten trapped. He didn't want to think about it. An older officer handed over the paperwork with a blank stare. He paused briefly before saying, "You sure about this one? This car's been here a while. Part of a closed case. Not exactly popular." Jason smiled politely and said he just needed it to get around. The officer didn't press further. The drive home was uneventful. The heater worked. The radio played, though only on one speaker. The back seat was cleaner than expected. He stopped by a gas station, bought an air freshener, and tossed it onto the dash without much thought. But every red light, every quiet stretch of road, brought his attention back to the rearview mirror. There was nothing there. Just the reflection of the back seat and the trunk behind it. Still, something about it itched at the edge of his mind. At home, he parked it outside the apartment complex and gave it a more thorough inspection. He vacuumed the seats, wiped down the interior, sprayed air freshener, and checked the glove box. Some old parking receipts, a broken pen, and a stick of gum fused to the plastic tray. But the trunk wouldn't open. He clicked the trunk release. Nothing. Tried the key. No response. He thought maybe it was jammed. He made a mental note to buy WD-40 and try again later. But there was no urgency. He didn't have anything to put in the trunk anyway. That night, after a long shower, Jason stood at his bedroom window and looked down at the lot. The car was still there, parked under the orange glow of the flickering street lamp. The windows fogged slightly in the cold. He stared at it longer than he meant to. Something about the way it sat there, just still and dark, made his stomach twist. He pulled the curtains shut and went to bed. The dreams were strange. Not nightmares, not quite. Just images. Long, dark tunnels. Claustrophobic spaces. Heavy breathing echoing in the distance. He woke up sweaty, confused, but told himself it was nothing. Probably just stress or the cheap tacos he had eaten earlier. But the moment he stepped outside the next morning, the smell hit him again. It was stronger, pungent, and definitely coming from the car. He opened every door and let it air out while he went inside to eat. When he came back out, he tried the trunk again. Still locked tight. He even kicked it once in frustration. No rattle. No give. Just a solid, cold thunk. Over the next few days, the smell lessened but never fully disappeared. He started to ignore it. Threw a blanket over the back seat. Focused on class and getting to his part-time job. But every night, the car waited for him. Parked. Silent. Still. One evening, a classmate asked for a ride. Jason hesitated. Something about having someone else in the car made him uneasy. But he agreed anyway. As they drove, his classmate wrinkled his nose and asked, "What died in here?" Jason laughed it off. Said the car had been in storage for a while. Nothing serious. But that night, as he locked the car and turned toward the stairs, he thought he heard something. A thump. Faint. Barely there. Coming from the trunk. He froze. Turned back. Listened. Silence. He shook his head. Told himself it was the metal settling in the cold. Or maybe something shifting in the spare tire compartment. He didn't open it. Couldn't. The key still wouldn't work. The release button still did nothing. He walked back upstairs, his chest tight and his footsteps quick. Behind him, in the still darkness of the lot, the car sat quietly. Waiting. The second week with the car brought more tension than convenience. The smell no longer filled the air like before. It had settled instead, embedded in the seats and carpets, clinging to every fiber like it belonged. Jason had grown used to holding his breath when stepping inside, used to the little quirks and odd sounds the car made when it started. But what he couldn't get used to was the trunk. Still sealed. Still silent. But never forgotten. He tried again with the key, turning it slowly while pressing against the latch. Nothing. He crawled into the back seat and pushed against the barrier between the cabin and the trunk, thinking maybe there was an emergency release. There wasn't. He even removed the lining from the trunk's interior wall just in case, but behind the fabric was only cold steel. No bolts, no latches, no levers. The barrier seemed almost deliberately seamless. Sealed from the inside. It became a daily obsession. He searched online for videos about unlocking stuck trunks, forums filled with amateur mechanics and DIY fixes. He learned more about trunk mechanisms than he ever thought he'd need to. Still, nothing worked. The trunk refused him every time. His tools weren't enough, and he didn't have the money for a body shop. He began to feel like the car was taunting him, offering up just enough usability to be necessary, but withholding that one locked part as if protecting something sacred. The noise started again the following Thursday. It was late, past midnight. The streets were empty. He was lying in bed when a faint thump reached his ears. Not loud, not violent, but rhythmic, deliberate. He sat up and waited. The sound didn't come again. He walked to the window. The car was parked as usual under the street lamp, untouched. The wind pushed trash along the curb. But everything else was still. The following night, the sound came again. This time it was louder. 3 distinct bangs. Then silence. It came at the exact same time, 2:13 a.m. Jason checked his phone when he heard it, and the digital clock stared back with that same cursed minute. He wanted to believe it was a coincidence. A passing car. A neighbor's trash bin knocked over. But it wasn't. Something about it felt too centered. Too close. Too intentional. The third night, it didn't stop. It came again, 2:13 a.m. sharp, and this time it didn't come in 3s. It came in 6. Thump, 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 pause, thump, 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 and then silence. Like a pattern. Like someone knocking from inside the trunk. Jason stood in the hallway, frozen, the sound echoing in his ears long after it ended. The next day he searched for dead animals hidden in car trunks. Rats, raccoons, feral cats. But nothing he read accounted for how clean the smell had become. No visible stains, no fur, no mess. Just a locked compartment that refused to open and a smell that wouldn't die. He started sleeping with his headphones in, but it didn't help. The thumps now lived in his memory, repeating whether they happened or not. He stopped offering rides to anyone. stopped talking about the car at all. The people at school noticed his silence, but they didn't ask questions. He became more withdrawn, more tired. Every morning brought with it the weight of the unanswered night. He avoided eye contact with the car during the day, avoided walking too close to the back. But always, in the corner of his eye, he could see it, dark, still watching. Eventually, he placed a small camera in the apartment window, angled directly at the parking lot. A cheap one, meant for indoor baby monitoring. It recorded on motion. He told himself it was just for peace of mind. The first night, it recorded nothing. The second, nothing. But on the third, the motion sensor activated at exactly 2:13 a.m. The clip lasted 22 seconds. It showed the car, unmoving, under the street lamp. Then, without warning, the car shifted. A slight tilt, like the suspension bounced under sudden pressure. And then the trunk, though still closed, visibly trembled. A slight flexing, like something inside was pressing upward from within. Then a sharp jolt, and the car settled again. The trunk lid never opened, but the metal had bent. Just slightly. Just enough to catch the light. Jason watched the clip 10 times. 20 times. He studied the frame before and after. There were no people. No animals. No wind. Only that shuddering, unnatural movement. The next morning, he inspected the trunk. His fingers traced the edges, where the steel once sat flush. Now, the right side was warped. A small rise in the metal, like something had pressed hard against it from the inside. The paint had cracked. He didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. He stayed awake, lights on, phone recording, watching the clock tick toward 2:13 a.m. When the sound came, he didn't move. He didn't look. But the banging was louder than before. By the end of the month, Jason no longer treated the car as transportation. It had become a problem to manage. Every day was a ritual of denial. Wake up, ignore the fact that something inside the trunk moved at night, go to class, pretend the stench hadn't followed him into the lecture hall, come home, try to sleep before 2:13 a.m. The dread was constant, humming in the background like a broken radio that never turned off. It clung to him in the daylight and became unbearable once the sun set. The worst part wasn't the sound anymore. It was the silence afterward. That drawn-out quiet following the violent thumping, complete, oppressive, endless. It made his ears ring. He found himself whispering sometimes, as if afraid to wake something, as if it listened. He stopped recording. The final video he reviewed showed a single pale hand slamming once against the inside of the trunk. Just one frame, barely visible through a hairline split in the metal, but it was there. Translucent skin, elongated fingers, no fingernails. And then, nothing. After that, he unplugged the camera and put it in a drawer. He couldn't bring himself to delete the file. But he never watched it again. The nightmares followed. Not dreams of the car, but of dark spaces. Enclosed places. He dreamed of being inside a narrow room, no windows, no exits, with walls that breathed in and out like lungs. He'd wake drenched in sweat, gasping for air, convinced his own bed had walls that closed in when his eyes were shut. Eventually, he moved his mattress to the floor, away from the wall entirely. It didn't help. He became obsessed with car reports. Stolen vehicles, missing persons, salvage yards. Every night he combed through local news archives, searching for any mention of the make and model he now drove. There was nothing. No VIN numbers reported stolen, no license plate matches in police databases. As far as any official source was concerned, the car had never existed before he bought it. The DMV office was worse. When he requested the original title and history, the clerk behind the glass frowned. There were inconsistencies in the records. The vehicle had no prior ownership, no emissions history, no previous inspections. It was as if it had appeared from nowhere. Even the temporary registration he'd been given was a copy of a copy, blurry, incomplete, untraceable. It wasn't long before he gave up trying to explain it logically. The car didn't behave according to mechanical rules. He could fill the tank, change the oil, drive it 20 miles and back, and the trunk would remain untouched, yet always feel active. Like the car wasn't a machine but a container. And whatever it held was patient. Waiting. The thumping didn't happen every night anymore. It skipped days. Sometimes it returned louder, more aggressive. Other times it vanished entirely for a week, leaving behind a silence that felt cruel. He began to wonder if it was taunting him, deliberately breaking patterns to unbalance his thoughts. He'd lie awake not because the sound was coming, but because he didn't know whether it would. Every attempt to force the trunk open failed. He took a crowbar to the edge once, sweating under the midday sun, jamming the tip into the groove with everything he had. The steel refused to give. The leverage broke the tool before it bent the metal. And the second he stopped prying, he felt it, that vibration. Subtle. Internal. Like something inside had felt the pressure and was responding with movement. Slow. Purposeful. He stepped away, shaking, and never touched the crowbar again. Other things began to change. Small things, but wrong. His phone alarm rang at times he hadn't set. Emails vanished from his inbox, ones he was certain he'd written. The trunk would sometimes feel warm to the touch, even after sitting untouched in freezing temperatures all night. Once, he found a long scratch down the back windshield. 3 straight lines, almost like fingers. No other car was parked near him that night. No animals could have reached that height. And there were no footprints in the snow. The isolation deepened. Friends texted less. His roommate moved out suddenly, citing vague unease and cold drafts in the apartment. Jason didn't blame him. The air inside the place had turned heavy, as if it, too, carried the same weight as the thing in the trunk, as if the rot and presence of the vehicle had followed him inside. He began to dream of highways, endless, black, empty. A long drive with no destination. Just the road, the low hum of tires, and the ever-present sense that something waited in the rear of the vehicle, just inches away, pressing against the barrier with quiet hunger. The line between waking and sleep blurred. Between what was imagined and what was real. But one thing remained consistent, etched into his memory with cruel precision. Every thump that came at 2:13 a.m. was a little bit louder than the last. Jason stopped parking the car near his apartment. Something about it felt too invasive now, like its presence leaked through walls, poisoning everything around it. He began leaving it in a distant, overgrown lot near an abandoned mall, where no one else ever went. Still, he couldn't bring himself to let it go. Part of him feared what might happen if he left it alone too long. Another part feared what might follow him home if he ever truly abandoned it. He started walking more. Taking buses. Anything to avoid sitting in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, knowing what sat behind him just inches away. But even with distance, the bond didn't break. He would still wake at exactly 2:13 a.m., his chest tight, air frozen in his lungs. Sometimes, he'd jolt upright convinced he'd heard the thump again, only to realize the car was miles away. It didn't matter. The sound now lived inside his head. Inside his heartbeat. His grades slipped. He missed entire weeks of lectures, his mind too scattered to focus. Professors reached out, but he ignored them. He no longer wanted to explain himself. What could he even say? That he bought a car with a sealed trunk that thumped like a coffin and gave him nightmares? That he believed something was inside, something not dead, not alive, just wrong? He had no evidence, only the escalating weight of his own unraveling thoughts. Then the smell returned. Stronger. Thicker. It clung to his clothes, to his backpack, even when he hadn't been near the car for days. Other passengers on the bus would wrinkle their noses and shift away from him. His neighbors stopped saying hello. One even left a passive-aggressive note on his door suggesting he washes laundry more often. But no amount of washing helped. The odor came from within, deep, rotting, sour. In desperation, he took the car to a mechanic, a new one far from town, hoping they might find a logical explanation. But as soon as the man approached the trunk, his face changed. Not curiosity, not suspicion, just quiet fear. He tapped the surface gently, listened, then stepped back. When Jason asked if he could open it, the mechanic just shook his head. Said it wasn't locked, it was sealed. Like welded from the inside. Jason didn't ask what that meant. He didn't want to know. That night, he stayed awake until morning. Not because of the noise, there was none, but because something worse had begun to settle in. A sense of attention. Like he wasn't observing the car anymore. It was observing him. Watching. Learning. Every time he passed by its resting place, he felt it, this magnetic pull, heavy and ancient, like the weight of guilt or a forgotten promise. He tried getting rid of it. Listed it for sale anonymously online. A junkyard finally agreed to take it for parts, no questions asked. He delivered it personally, left the keys on the counter, and walked away without looking back. For the first time in months, he felt like breathing might be possible again. A lightness, even if temporary. But the next morning, it was parked outside his apartment. Keys on the hood. The scratch on the back windshield had grown deeper. He didn't tell anyone. He just stood there in silence, unable to comprehend how a vehicle he had physically handed off miles away had returned, untouched, uninvited, inevitable. There were no camera records in his building. No tire tracks on the sidewalk. Just the car, waiting like it always had been. Like it always would be. The dreams changed after that. They were no longer just of roads and shadows. Now he saw people. Faces blurred, mouths sewn shut. All trapped in narrow spaces, suffocating. Their hands pressed to glass that didn't break, their eyes wide with frozen screams. Sometimes, he'd wake up with his own hands clenched so tight his knuckles bled. Once, he awoke in the bathtub fully clothed, water overflowing, the faucet still running. He stopped trusting mirrors. Every reflection looked slightly off, slightly delayed. His own eyes seemed wrong. Not someone else's, but not his either. As if something else had begun mimicking him, learning him from the inside out. He thought of fire, dreamt of gasoline, fantasized about watching the car turn to ash. But some deep instinct screamed not to. Not because it wouldn't work, but because it would. And something inside might not burn. It might crawl out instead. And worst of all, he knew now that it didn't matter how far he ran. The trunk was no longer a place. It was a presence. An idea that had taken root. Something ancient and patient that had found him through the smallest crack in logic and lodged itself into the quietest parts of his mind. The thumping had stopped completely. But now, every night at 2:13 a.m., the lock on the trunk clicked open. Jason didn't open the trunk. Even when he heard the soft, deliberate click of the lock releasing each night at 2:13 a.m., he never touched it. Something deeper than fear, something older, more instinctual, warned him not to. He began treating the vehicle like a wild animal. He wouldn't approach it. He wouldn't look directly at it. He left it parked and untouched in that same overgrown lot and walked past it without acknowledgement. He didn't need to interact with it anymore. It had already done what it came to do. He felt it in his mind now, like a quiet echo, a shifting presence at the edge of every thought. When he stood in the shower or brushed his teeth or sat in class pretending to be normal, he could feel that subtle internal pressure, like something waiting for him to acknowledge it. A psychic weight, not a physical one. As if the idea of the trunk, the secret of it, had planted itself in the folds of his consciousness and began to bloom. He started losing time. Minutes vanished. Sometimes hours. He would look at the clock and then again moments later to find it had skipped ahead by a full day. His phone was filled with voice memos he didn't remember recording, garbled whispers, strange coordinates, even laughter. His calendar was filled with appointments he didn't make, return, witness, unseal. At first, he deleted them. But they returned, rewritten in different formats, different apps. He began waking up to sticky notes on his desk, written in his own handwriting but using phrasing he'd never use. It sees you now. You let it in. You're the lock. The worst was the one that simply read, passenger. He threw that one away and tried not to think about it. He started seeing a shape in his peripheral vision. Not every day, but often enough to notice. Always at night, always just beyond full focus. A hunched figure, almost human, never moving but never quite still. It stood near corners, behind light posts, on the far end of empty hallways. And always, when he turned, it would be gone, yet the sensation of being studied would linger long after. His sleep deteriorated entirely. The nightmares blurred with waking life. He'd lie in bed and feel the weight of something climbing onto his chest, but he couldn't move, couldn't scream. He'd hear the click of the trunk opening in his mind, feel cold air brush against his face, smell rot and rust and age, and then wake to find the bedroom window wide open, the room filled with the faintest scent of metal. He avoided mirrors altogether. The person reflected in them had begun to move differently, slightly delayed, slightly out of sync, as though whatever watched him from the other side was forgetting how to copy him correctly. It blinked too slowly. It tilted its head when he didn't. He'd catch it smiling faintly while his own mouth remained still. Eventually, he covered every mirror with blankets and sheets. But that only made things worse. Now he could imagine the reflections watching him from behind the cloth, and that imagination was far more dangerous than the truth. The car keys disappeared. At first, he thought he'd lost them. But then they began appearing in strange places, on his pillow when he woke up, in the fridge, under his toothbrush. Always cold to the touch. Always facing upward. One night, he found them buried in a bowl of uncooked rice. Another time, sealed inside a plastic bag floating in the toilet tank. He began to understand that he wasn't dealing with a haunted object. This wasn't about possession or curses or the ghost of a victim sealed in a trunk. That was too simple, too human. What had latched onto him wasn't seeking justice. It wasn't trying to be freed. It was trying to expand, to evolve. The car, the trunk, it was just a door. A threshold. What lay inside didn't need to speak or scream or even be seen. It only needed to be thought about. The more he feared it, studied it, tried to understand it, the deeper it rooted into him. Like a parasite that fed not on flesh, but on perception. The more real it became to him, the more space it took in the world. It wasn't just in the trunk anymore. It was in his shadow, in the corners of his thoughts, in the forgotten seconds between blinks. And now it had learned something else, how to reach through others, how to travel from one mind to the next, how to slip between cracks left by whispered rumors, late-night curiosity, online posts, and stories told by people like him, people who had seen the edge and survived just long enough to pass it on. The car hadn't been sold to him randomly. It had been sent. And someone else would be next. Jason stopped trying to resist. He no longer walked past the car pretending it didn't exist. He acknowledged it in silence, met its presence with numb acceptance. The difference wasn't surrender, it was transformation. He no longer felt like the same person who had once seen the listing, driven it home, and ignored the distant noise in the trunk. That person was gone. In his place was something quieter, hollowed out. Observant. The car didn't frighten him anymore. Not because it had become less disturbing, but because it had become familiar. It was like a wound that no longer hurt, just itched. A constant companion in the background of every thought, shaping his habits, his patterns, his sense of reality. It was the gravity pulling his life inward, narrowing his choices until the only thing left was it. He began receiving emails from unknown addresses, always empty, except for a subject line. You heard it too. It followed me home. Mine thumped at 3 a.m. The messages would vanish moments after appearing, deleted from his inbox before he could respond. His browser history began autofilling strange searches, vehicle sealed from inside, body in trunk urban legend, thump at night dream meaning, how to unsee something. His bank account showed recurring monthly payments to a company he didn't recognize. The receipts were for storage services and containment fees. One even read, mental lease extended, subject compliant. He tried calling the number listed, but it always went to static, and yet he could hear his own breathing faintly in the background. Once, he tried asking someone for help, a former friend, distant now. He didn't explain everything, just enough to suggest something was wrong with the car. The friend offered to come with him, to help inspect it, maybe open the trunk together. Jason agreed. They made plans. Set a time. The friend never arrived. When Jason checked their social media the next morning, every account had been deleted. Mutual contacts claimed to have never heard of him. Photos in Jason's phone where the friend had once appeared were now empty, blurred as if the person had never existed. The text history remained, but every message was from Jason to himself. He began noticing strangers watching him. Not suspiciously, reverently, as if they recognized something in him that they also carried. A shared infection. A brotherhood of the marked. One man nodded solemnly at Jason from a passing train window. A woman in a gas station whispered, "It's louder," before the silence. None of them lingered. None needed to. Whatever had been in the trunk didn't need a physical form. It never had. The thumping was just an echo, an ancient rhythm. A knock on the inside of sanity. A pulse that, once heard, never left. Once acknowledged, it spread. And Jason had acknowledged it. He had let it in. That was all it needed. Some nights, he didn't sleep at all. Not out of fear, but because sleep felt irrelevant. Time had softened into a loop. Past, present, and future tangled together like exposed wiring. He remembered buying the car, but now he also remembered other versions of the same moment. Buying different cars, hearing different sounds, waking up in different places. All roads led back to the same moment. The trunk. The seal. The sound. He understood that he was no longer a person. He was a vector. A carrier. The story would spread because it needed to. Because whatever had been trapped inside the vehicle, whether it was a memory, a curse, a living idea, it couldn't die alone. It required others to witness it, to feed it, to become vessels. He stopped attending class. Stopped responding to messages. He erased himself gradually from everything. Social networks, records, digital footprints. Not out of self-preservation, but because the thing inside him demanded silence. Anonymity gave it space to grow. But he knew it wouldn't end with him. The car no longer moved, but its influence spread far beyond the rusted shell. It traveled in whispers, online posts, storytime videos late at night. It nested in the subconscious of anyone who listened too closely. The sound, the thump, didn't need to be real to infect someone. It only needed belief. A fragment of fear. That was the seed. Now the story would find new ears. Someone would hear it in passing, maybe in a comment section, maybe in a bedtime podcast, maybe on a subreddit at 3 a.m. They'd scroll past, only to return. Curiosity always won. They'd wonder if it was real. They'd picture it. They'd imagine the sound. They'd dream of it. They'd hear it. And then, one night, they'd walk past a car that seemed older than it should be. One with tinted windows, a cracked windshield, and no clear owner. One parked a little too long in the same spot. The smell might be faint. The air might feel too still. But the feeling, that weight behind the ribs, that subtle creeping awareness, would be unmistakable. They'd keep walking. But it would already be too late. End of Story 1. Story 2. They say houses hold memories. But what if a house remembers things it should never have witnessed? When a retired building inspector buys a cheap foreclosure in rural Pennsylvania, he thinks he's found his peaceful project for retirement. That is, until he discovers a steel-sealed door in the basement. Behind it, hundreds of dusty VHS tapes, each one dated, each one showing horrifying footage of strangers being watched inside their own homes. But the most terrifying part, one of the tapes has tomorrow's date on it, and the man being watched is him. The listing went live for only 13 minutes before being pulled again. A decaying Victorian on the edge of a forgotten Pennsylvania town, priced so far below market value that it almost felt like a joke. No photos of the interior. Just one line, cash buyers only. As is. No walkthroughs. And yet, a day later, the inspector had the deed in hand. No questions asked. A single email. A wire transfer. A signature on a PDF. It was the fastest transaction of his life, and the most unsettling. The house stood crookedly on a weed-choked lot surrounded by thick trees, set far back from the nearest road. Locals in the area refused to talk about it. When asked for directions, they changed the subject or claimed they'd never heard of it. But that wasn't uncommon in small towns like this. People liked their distance. Secrets stayed buried longer in the quiet. The porch sagged. The windows were boarded, though not from the outside. That detail didn't register until much later. Inside, the air was stale but not moldy. It smelled more like paper. Dusty, heavy, untouched for decades. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing pale claw-like marks underneath that might have once been old paint. Or maybe not. The previous owners hadn't left anything behind. No furniture. No photographs. Not a single box or belonging. It was as though the place had been vacuumed of human presence. But the inspector had walked hundreds of abandoned homes. None of this truly fazed him. Until the basement. The door was normal enough, a basic wooden slab with rusted hinges. But it didn't budge. Not from the handle, not from pressure. It felt sealed, almost as if it were pretending to be a door rather than actually functioning as one. The wall around it was slightly discolored. When he knocked, it didn't echo like hollow drywall. It thudded like a vault. He let it go for a few days. Worked on the upstairs flooring. Repaired some warped beams. Tried to convince himself that the strange resistance in the air was nothing more than years of dust and neglect. But the basement door sat in the back of his mind like a blinking cursor, always waiting. A prompt he couldn't ignore. When he finally decided to investigate, he brought a crowbar and flashlight. Beneath the thin wooden frame, he found signs of welding. The hinges weren't installed, they were embedded. Reinforced. Industrial grade. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep the door shut from the inside. Not to keep people out, but to keep something in. That night, the wind howled more than usual. It wasn't a storm. Just constant wind. No pattern. No rise or fall. It whispered through the walls like breath. 3 more days passed before the door gave way. Not easily. It took hours of labor, scraping through old solder, metal flakes embedding in his hands. When the final bolt snapped, the door creaked open an inch. Just enough for the smell to escape. Not rot. Not mold. Just old air. Heavy air. Like the breath of a sealed tomb finally exhaled after decades. The room beyond was smaller than he expected. Claustrophobic. Windowless. Lined wall to wall with shelves, each shelf stacked with unmarked VHS tapes, hundreds of them. At the far end was a table, and on that table, an old VCR. No power cord. No TV. Just the VCR, sitting there like an offering. Or a challenge. None of the tapes had labels beyond dates. The earliest one read, August 2nd, 1983. The most recent was from late 2002. After that, a long gap. But something felt off. The tapes were too clean, too orderly. As if someone had kept them catalogued. Maintained. Preserved them. He brought a few upstairs, curious but cautious. Dust clung to the magnetic film like skin. He didn't even own a VCR anymore. Who did? But curiosity overruled logic. The contents of that room were deliberately hidden. Hidden deep. Why? And who had gone to such lengths to bury them? He couldn't shake the feeling that someone had intended for him to find them. That the sale of the house wasn't about offloading property, it was about passing responsibility. As if he hadn't bought the house, but inherited something. Inherited a duty. Or a curse. Outside, the wind never stopped. The neighbors' homes sat dark and silent, no matter the hour. The trees surrounding the property didn't sway, they leaned. Always inward. Toward the house. He began to dream in static. His nights filled with flashes of grainy footage he hadn't yet watched. Images he hadn't yet seen. But deep down, he knew the house remembered. It had a memory, one deeper than plaster and brick. Something had happened here. Many things. Things that were recorded. And now, it was his turn to witness them. Whatever was sealed in the basement wasn't waiting to be discovered. It was waiting to be remembered. The first tape he played was marked simply, October 14th, 1997. The screen flickered to life, grainy black and white footage filling the small TV. The image was of a suburban living room. A man sat in an armchair, reading a newspaper, unaware of the camera's gaze. A woman moved about quietly in the background, folding laundry. 2 children played on the floor. The camera angle shifted slowly, as if tracking their every move, but never stepping into the light. There was no indication of who filmed it or why. No faces beyond the home's inhabitants. No voices, just silence punctuated by the faint creaks and sighs of an ordinary house. Yet the atmosphere was oppressive. Watching it felt like trespassing through someone's private life without their knowledge or consent. The man lowered his paper and glanced toward the window. The camera didn't move. The man's eyes never met the lens, but the sensation of being watched was undeniable. Time passed, and the tape showed nothing out of the ordinary, just the rhythms of a family evening unfolding in slow motion. He stopped the tape and rewound it. The desire to understand why someone would obsessively record the mundane gnawed at him. Was this some kind of voyeuristic collection? Or a sinister archive of people's lives, stored away like trophies? One tape led to another and another. With every video, the pattern grew clearer. The recordings were deliberate, focused on ordinary people in their private spaces, living moments meant to be unseen by others. There was no violence on the tapes, no screams or threats. Just watching. Patient, meticulous watching. Some tapes showed empty rooms with doors slowly creaking open by themselves. Others revealed people talking on phones, moving from room to room, unaware of the invisible eye trained on them. On several tapes, the camera angle shifted just slightly, revealing hints of a hidden room or a dark figure lurking just beyond the frame's edge. It was impossible to tell where the cameras were hidden. Behind walls? Inside light fixtures? Buried in furniture? The technology was primitive by today's standards, yet sophisticated enough to remain undetected. This wasn't the work of an amateur. He searched for connections between the people on the tapes. Sometimes a name was whispered on a phone call. Sometimes a date scrawled on a calendar in the background. But mostly, these were lives frozen in time, memories trapped on magnetic tape without explanation or context. Slowly, unease grew. As the days passed, he felt watched, even when alone in the house. Every creak and whisper of the old building felt amplified. The shadows seemed to deepen. The wind outside rose and fell like a slow pulse. Then he found a tape dated July 2, 1998, with a label scrawled in shaky handwriting, "She knows." The image was of a woman sitting in a chair, staring blankly at a wall. Her eyes were hollow. The camera held steady as she began to whisper words that were almost inaudible, broken phrases like a confession or a warning. She spoke of being followed, of someone watching her through walls, of the feeling that her own house was no longer safe. The tape ended abruptly, the screen going black with a sudden burst of static. It was the first tape that felt alive. More than observation. It was a cry for help. But help never came. He began to cross-reference the dates with missing person reports, police records from the town and surrounding counties. Slowly, the chilling truth emerged. Some of the people on the tapes had disappeared without a trace. The dates matched exactly. The families left with unanswered questions and cold cases gathering dust. The house was more than a home. It was a repository of terror. The tapes documented lives before they vanished. Not always in that order, but always connected. A chilling archive of those who were watched, and then taken. As he pieced together the puzzle, he found more disturbing details. Footage showed strange visits by shadowy figures late at night. Doors opening on their own. Whispers in the background that seemed to be captured by the microphone. Soft, indecipherable voices calling names. One tape showed a man breaking into a home at night, rifling through drawers, planting something. Another tape showed a different man, apparently a detective, reviewing similar footage on a VCR in a dimly lit room, scribbling notes on a pad. The detective's face was never fully visible. But the obsession was clear. Someone was watching the watchers. The tapes formed a web. A network of surveillance, obsession, and disappearance stretching back decades. The question was who was behind it all, and why. Then came the tape with no date. Unmarked. Blank label. When played, it showed the basement room itself, the shelves lined with tapes, the table with the old VCR. Then the camera panned slowly toward the basement door. A shadow crossed the frame, indistinct, but unmistakably human. The door creaked closed from the inside. The screen went black. He stopped the tape, heart pounding. Whoever made these recordings was not just watching strangers. They were watching him, waiting for him. His reality began to fracture. Sleep became elusive. The house seemed to breathe around him, walls shifting in the corner of his vision. He felt eyes on him in every room. The tapes weren't just evidence. They were a message. The house remembered. And it wasn't finished yet. The discovery of the unmarked tape changed everything. It was a subtle shift, imperceptible at first, but undeniable once recognized. The house, once merely a silent container of forgotten memories, now felt like an active participant. Something within the walls had awoken. The tapes had once been just recordings, distant echoes from other lives. Now, they seemed to pulse with intention, like warnings whispered through static. The more he watched, the clearer it became that someone, or something, was orchestrating the surveillance. Not just passively recording, but directing. Patterns emerged in the footage. Certain houses reappeared repeatedly, each time showing different moments: a light flickering, a door opening and closing slowly, a figure lingering in the background just beyond focus. The victims were never alone. Shadows loomed behind them, uninvited presences that appeared more than once, as if waiting for their cue. The house itself held clues. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the main hallway, he found a weathered notebook, its pages yellowed and edges torn. The handwriting was cramped, frantic. Notes, dates, names, and symbols interspersed with odd diagrams of rooms and lines connecting dots, like a map of surveillance points. The notebook described the Watchers and the Taken. A final note read, "They always return." There was no author named, no signature. But it was clear this was someone involved deeply with the tapes, possibly the person who created them. Someone who understood that what was being recorded was more than simple observation. The notebook mentioned rituals, strange ceremonies held late at night, whispered incantations aimed at capturing souls in the lens. The implication was terrifying. This was no ordinary stalking. It was a deliberate capturing of lives, using the tapes as a vessel. The house's basement was no mere storage room. It was a shrine, a tomb, a gateway. His mind raced back to the door itself, sealed with metal and solder. The thought of what had been locked away behind it was unbearable. Whatever had been contained had been kept separate for a reason, and that reason was fear. The tapes seemed to have a life cycle: recorded, stored, and then left to fade, but never truly erased. Some appeared to be rewound and replayed multiple times, as though someone studied them obsessively. The longer he spent in the house, the more he felt himself drawn into the same obsession. Sleep slipped away. Days blurred into nights. The shadows at the edge of vision grew thicker, more persistent. He started to hear things: the soft hum of a static-filled television turning on in another room, the faint scratching of a tape being rewound. Yet no devices were active. One evening, the power cut out abruptly. The house went dark except for the glow of the streetlights filtering through grimy windows. He lit a candle and returned to the basement, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. The air grew cold. The silence thickened. On the table lay a new tape, one he hadn't seen before. No label, no date. With trembling hands, he set the tape in the VCR and pressed play. The footage was unlike anything before. It showed the house from angles he didn't recognize. The camera moved smoothly, as if held by an invisible hand, gliding through corridors and rooms with unnatural precision. The basement door appeared in view, slightly ajar. Then the figure appeared. It was tall, obscured in darkness, face hidden beneath a hood. The figure moved with deliberate slowness, approaching the camera as if aware of its presence. The room's shadows deepened around it, folding inward like living things. Suddenly, the image distorted. The screen shimmered, the picture breaking into flickering fragments. A whisper rose, indecipherable at first, then forming words that echoed faintly: "Release! Release!" The tape ended abruptly. He sat frozen, the silence pressing down like a physical weight. The whisper was not a plea, but a command. It became clear: whatever was trapped behind that basement door was reaching out. Desperate, angry, waiting for release. His thoughts spiraled. What was imprisoned there? Why had it been sealed? And what price would be paid if it was freed? The notebook's warnings echoed louder: "They always return. The Watchers. The Taken." The house was a vessel, but also a prison. And the boundary between the two was thinning. Outside, the wind picked up again. It carried with it a scent of damp earth and decay. The house groaned, settling into its foundations, as if breathing. He knew the tapes were not just records of past horrors. They were warnings, messages encoded in flickering light and shadow, urging caution. But curiosity was a dangerous thing. The deeper he delved, the more the house demanded of him. Not just attention, but sacrifice. And the basement door. The basement door waited silently, its secrets locked behind layers of cold metal and silence. The deeper the investigation went, the more the lines between reality and nightmare blurred. The tapes were no longer just recordings. They were fragments of a living nightmare, captured and preserved in a loop that fed itself endlessly. Every video was a window into another life, another world trapped beneath the surface of what seemed ordinary. The victims' faces, once blurred by distance and time, began to haunt the edges of consciousness. Names, faces, whispered voices in the dark. They were no longer just images on a screen, but echoes that lingered in the mind long after the tapes were stopped. Each disappeared person was a thread unraveling a much larger, darker tapestry. Patterns appeared in the victims' lives before they vanished. Signs ignored or dismissed, strange noises, sudden cold spots, fleeting shadows. Loved ones spoke of unease, a creeping dread that invaded their homes and hearts. The house wasn't just a place, it was a catalyst. It awakened something ancient, something hungry. The old notebook became a guidebook to a world hidden beneath the surface of the mundane. The cryptic symbols and maps pointed to locations around the town. Empty lots, abandoned buildings, places marked by tragedy. The notes referenced an entity, something older than time, feeding on fear and pain. It wasn't human, yet it wore the guise of one. It watched through the eyes of the cameras, manipulating events like a puppeteer pulling invisible strings. The basement door's lock was a symbol, a barrier not just of metal and wood but of will and power. What lay behind was something the watchers feared, a force that defied capture, one that could break free if the lock was undone. The warnings were clear. Breaking that seal would unleash a darkness beyond comprehension. Sleep was no longer a refuge. Dreams became invaded by shadowy figures and whispered warnings. The tapes invaded the mind, replaying moments of terror in endless loops. Faces appeared in reflections, voices echoed in empty rooms. The house became a prison, but the prisoner was not the investigator. It was the force trapped beneath the basement. Contact with the outside world grew strained. Calls went unanswered, neighbors kept their distance, the once familiar streets took on an eerie silence. The sense of isolation tightened its grip. The house was a vortex, pulling inward and closing off escape. The investigation revealed hints of a secret society operating in the shadows, tied to the house and its history. Their purpose was unclear. Keepers? Worshippers? Or something darker? The notes mentioned rituals, sacrifices made to keep the entity contained, rituals now forgotten or abandoned. Pieces of the past emerged, old newspaper clippings, faded photographs, police reports long buried. Each piece hinted at the house's sinister legacy. The disappearances were not isolated incidents but part of a cycle. A pattern repeated every few decades, each time leaving scars deeper than before. The tapes showed evidence of failed attempts to destroy or escape the entity. People tried to flee, to burn the house down, to call for help, but all vanished without a trace. The house always remained, silent and watching. The house was alive in ways that defied logic. Walls seemed to breathe, floors whispered underfoot. The shadows moved independently, curling and stretching like living things. The air grew thick with anticipation, heavy with unseen eyes. The final pages of the notebook were stained and torn, as if the author had been desperate to conceal what came next. But a single phrase stood out: the key is not outside, but within. It hinted at a terrible truth, that the entity's power was linked not just to the house, but to the minds of those who sought it. The watchers were not just observers, they were participants in the horror. The act of watching itself fed the darkness, strengthened it. Every attempt to unravel the mystery only tightened the grip. The tapes were a trap, a snare for the curious. And now he was caught. The basement door remained closed, the lock cold and unyielding. Yet behind it, something stirred. A slow, pulsing presence that filled the silence with a promise of release. The house had claimed many. It was patient, waiting for the right moment, the right person to open the door. And that moment was coming. The weight of the unknown pressed down with increasing force. Every detail uncovered seemed to spiral into darker depths, revealing layers of horror that defied reason. The tapes, the notebook, the basement door, they were all threads woven into a sinister web, each tug unraveling more of a nightmare than a mystery. The entity was no mere ghost or spirit. It was a force, ancient and malevolent, anchored not only to the house but to the very fabric of fear itself. It fed on attention, thriving in the watching eyes, growing stronger with every new victim drawn into its orbit. The act of observing became an act of surrender, a giving in to a force that twisted perception and reality. Attempts to communicate with the outside world were met with resistance. Technology failed. Phones dropped calls, emails never sent, messages vanished into the void. It was as if the house exerted a field of influence, isolating its prey and severing lifelines. The investigator found himself cut off, trapped within a bubble of creeping dread. Sleep became a battleground. The boundary between waking and dreaming blurred, nightmares leaking into daylight hours. Faces from the tapes appeared in reflections. At the periphery of vision, shadows that moved against the natural flow of light. The house's silence was deceptive. It was filled with whispers and murmurs, just beyond hearing, stirring the imagination into terror. Every room held a secret, every corner a hidden presence. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen life, breathing slowly, as if alive. The air thickened with a sense of waiting, patient, inevitable. The basement door stood as a silent sentinel, its lock a final barrier between known reality and the abyss beyond. The notebook's cryptic warnings echoed louder with every passing hour. The key lay within, but what that meant was elusive. It was not a physical key, but a psychological one, a choice, a surrender, or a confrontation. To unlock the door was to confront the darkness not just outside but inside. The investigation uncovered a disturbing truth. The watchers were themselves trapped in cycles of obsession and madness. Their lives consumed by the house's pull, their wills eroded by the very knowledge they sought. The tapes were their legacy, a record of their descent into terror and despair. The victims' stories were interwoven, families broken, lives erased, memories fragmented. The house was a parasite, feeding off the anguish it created. Each disappearance was a sacrifice, a renewal of its dark power. There was no escape. Attempts to flee were thwarted by unseen forces. Doors slammed shut, paths twisted into dead ends. The house reshaped itself, a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty. The walls closed in, shrinking the world until only the basement door remained as a threshold to an unknown fate. The tapes held glimpses of salvation, but they were riddled with traps. Moments where the victims seemed to fight back, to resist the entity's grip, only to be swallowed whole by it in the end. The house was patient, indifferent to resistance, but relentless in pursuit. The final entries in the notebook spoke of a ritual, a chance to sever the bond, to break the cycle. But the ritual came with a price. It required a sacrifice of self, a willingness to face the darkness without flinching. The line between salvation and destruction was razor thin. The investigator felt the pull of the house intensify. The basement door loomed larger in his thoughts, a magnetic force drawing him closer. He realized the truth. To survive, he would have to unlock that door. To understand the entity, to confront it head-on. But what waited behind the door was unknown. The house's legacy was one of terror and loss. The watchers' warnings were clear. Those who opened the door did not return the same, if they returned at all. Time became a distorted concept. Hours passed like minutes, nights stretched endlessly. The house's grip tightened, an invisible noose choking the edges of reality. The investigator's reflection in the mirror showed eyes darkened by exhaustion and fear. The choice was unavoidable. To continue meant risking everything: sanity, life, perhaps even soul. To retreat was to surrender to the entity's slow, inevitable hunger. The house was not just a location. It was a state of being, a manifestation of fear made flesh. And it demanded tribute. The basement door remained sealed, but the sound of a faint scratching began to echo from behind it, a reminder that the darkness was alive, waiting and patient. The moment to confront the unknown had arrived, but the question lingered: was it courage or desperation that drove the final act? The basement door was no longer just a barrier, but a threshold to a truth too terrible to ignore. Behind it lay the source of all the pain, fear, and disappearance, the heart of the entity's power. To unlock it was to risk everything. To leave it sealed was to remain trapped in a prison of shadows and doubt. The air grew heavier, charged with an oppressive energy that seemed to press down on the mind and body. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Every instinct screamed to stop, to turn away, but the pull was irresistible, a compulsion rooted deeper than reason. The past victims' faces flickered in memory, their stories merging into a single, desperate plea for release or vengeance. The lock resisted, cold and unyielding, but persistence wore it down. Each turn of the key echoed like a heartbeat, steady and relentless, counting down the moments before the final reveal. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the world itself paused on the edge of a knife. What lay beyond was neither fully physical nor entirely spiritual. It was a void filled with flickering shadows, a place where time and space fractured and twisted. The entity revealed itself, not as a shape or a figure but as a presence, a force of pure malevolence and hunger. It was ancient beyond measure, a predator that thrived on fear, despair, and broken souls. The entity's power was revealed in waves, crashing against the boundaries of sanity. It whispered in voices that felt both alien and intimately familiar, promising salvation and destruction in the same breath. It offered release from the torment of the house, but demanded a price that no one could truly pay. Resistance was futile. The darkness seeped into every corner of thought, every fragment of memory. The investigator felt his grip on reality slipping, replaced by a growing awareness of being consumed, absorbed into the endless cycle of watching and waiting. The entity was not just outside, it was inside, a parasite on the mind and soul. Yet within that consuming darkness, a flicker of defiance remained. The key to breaking the cycle was not just in opening the door, but in confronting the fear itself. The power the entity wielded came from the terror it invoked, the surrender it demanded. To resist was to reclaim power, to deny the darkness the fuel it needed to grow. Memories of the past victims became a source of strength. Their struggle was not in vain. Their resistance, though ultimately overcome, left traces, signs that could be followed, clues that could be pieced together. The house's legacy was one of horror, but also of human resilience. The ritual described in the notebook was not merely a curse but a test. It required facing the darkest parts of oneself, the shadows within, and emerging unbroken. It was a path few could walk, but the alternative was endless suffering, trapped in the house's grip forever. As the entity's influence surged, a choice crystallized: succumb to the void or fight back with every ounce of will. The power to end the cycle lay not in destruction but in acceptance, understanding, and refusal to yield. The basement was a crucible, a place of transformation. Those who entered did not simply face an external evil but confronted the shadows within their own minds. The house was a mirror, reflecting fears, regrets, and guilt, distorting them into shapes of terror. The final moments before the confrontation were a whirlwind of sensation. Fear, pain, clarity, and resolve all intertwined. The entity's whispers grew louder, promising oblivion or redemption, blurring the line between nightmare and reality. In that liminal space, the investigator found something unexpected, a spark of hope, a will to survive that transcended the fear. The house's power was great, but it was not absolute. The human spirit, fragile yet fierce, held a light that could pierce even the deepest darkness. The cycle would not end with destruction but with understanding. The entity was a force of nature, a shadow cast by human fears and secrets. To break free was to accept the past, confront the pain, and refuse to be consumed by it. As the confrontation reached its peak, the oppressive weight began to lift, the darkness receded, not defeated, but held at bay by the strength of will. The house's silence returned, but it was different now, quieter, less threatening. The basement door closed behind, but the door within the mind remained open, a gateway to healing and peace. The tapes, the notebook, the house's legacy, they were not just a record of horror but a testament to resilience. The nightmare had ended, but the memory of the darkness remained, a warning and a reminder. Fear was a force to be respected but not feared beyond reason. The power to overcome lay within. The house, the entity, the basement, all were echoes of a deeper truth. And that truth was this: the greatest horror lies not in the shadows outside but in the shadows within. End of Story 2. Story 3. At exactly 3:07 a.m. every night, a small-town emergency dispatcher starts receiving silent 911 calls, all from the same phone number. But when police trace the calls to a house burned down in a horrific murder-suicide 20 years ago, the chilling truth begins to unfold. These calls aren't just echoes of the past. They are reaching out to her, and something on the other end knows her name. Every night, as the clock inches toward the small hours, A quiet tension settles over the emergency dispatch center. The usual hum of radios and faint murmur of voices is suddenly pierced by an unsettling pattern, a call that connects but yields only silence. No words, no noises, just the cold void on the other end of the line. At exactly 3:07 a.m., the dispatcher's phone lights up, once again, showing the same number every night. This number, unchanging, has become a haunting presence in an otherwise routine night shift. The silence is deafening. The dispatcher waits, heart pounding, listening intently for any sound, breathing, a cough, a whisper. But the line offers nothing, just the empty void of nothingness. Attempts to respond are met with the same void. No voice, no signal, only the unyielding quiet that presses down like a heavy fog. It's not a prank. It feels deliberate, charged with purpose, yet incomprehensible. With each successive night, the calls arrive punctually, carving a disturbing rhythm into the dispatcher's world. The first night brought confusion, the second suspicion. By the third, dread has begun to take root. Why this number? Why this time? The dispatcher checks records, calls back, but no one ever answers. The number doesn't appear on any local registries. It's as if the call comes from nowhere and everywhere at once. The toll of these silent calls is not just professional but deeply personal. Sleep becomes elusive, thoughts spiral uncontrollably during waking hours. Every beep, every static crackle on the radio triggers a jolt of anxiety. The mind, left to fill the void, conjures worst-case scenarios. Someone in desperate need, trapped in silence, unable to speak but pleading for help. The dispatcher feels the crushing weight of responsibility, burdened by the inability to respond to a silent cry. Colleagues start to notice the change. Eyes grow heavy during briefings, voices carry a thread of unease. The dispatcher's focus slips, distracted by the persistent question that hangs in the air like a thick mist. What, or who, is behind these silent calls? The mystery becomes an obsession, consuming time and energy, blurring the line between duty and fixation. This pattern, every night, same time, same number, begins to disrupt the natural order. The dispatcher's hands tremble slightly as the clock approaches 3:07 a.m., the moment charged with expectation and fear. The silence on the other end becomes a presence, almost tactile, as if something is waiting just beyond the edge of perception. Attempts to trace the calls initially yield no clues. The number's origin is obscured, masked, or erased. Technology falters, as if resisting the search for answers. Phones glitch, systems reboot, but the calls persist, unbroken. It's as though the line exists in a liminal space, straddling reality and something else, something beyond human comprehension. The dispatcher's mind races back to training, to protocols meant for clear emergencies, fires, accidents, violence, not for silence that screams in absence. The instinct to act, to help, clashes with helplessness. It is an invisible emergency, one that can't be measured, mapped, or managed. This silence is more terrifying than any cry for help, because it leaves no room for certainty or closure. Outside the dispatch center, the town sleeps unaware. Streets lie empty and dark, the quiet interrupted only by distant sirens or the rustling wind. The normal rhythms of life continue, oblivious to the silent terror that invades the dispatcher's nights. The calls remain a secret horror, a puzzle piece that refuses to fit. Despite the isolation, there's an undeniable connection, a thread pulling the dispatcher towards something larger, something buried deep in the town's forgotten past. The calls are more than random glitches or technical errors. They are signals, echoes, or warnings. Each night, the silence grows heavier, thick with meaning, with history, with dread. The weight of the unanswered question gnaws away at certainty. Was it a prank at first? No, too consistent, too precise. A malfunction? Technology fails, but never so perfectly, night after night. A ghost? The thought crosses the mind in moments of exhaustion, fleeting but persistent. Something trapped, something reaching out across the void? These silent calls force a confrontation not only with external mystery but internal fear. The fear of not knowing, of helplessness, of being alone in the dark. The calls hold a mirror to the human psyche, reflecting anxiety, isolation, and the desperate hope for connection. With every night that passes, the dispatcher's resolve hardens. The silent calls are no longer just a strange anomaly but a call to action, a puzzle demanding to be solved. Each unanswered ring carries the weight of countless unknown stories, pain, loss, maybe even death. The quiet holds the screams of a past waiting to be heard. The shift ends, but the silence does not. It follows into dreams and waking moments, an echo in the mind's recesses. The dispatcher begins to prepare, not just for the next shift, but for the next call. The anticipation is both dread and determination, a fragile line between despair and hope. In this liminal space, between night and dawn, between silence and sound, the true horror begins. Not what lurks in the dark, but what is carried in the silence. The calls at 3:07 a.m. are more than mystery. They are a breaking point, a threshold to a truth that refuses to stay buried. The dispatcher's world has changed forever. What started as a routine night shift has become a descent into an uncharted nightmare, where silence speaks louder than words, and every unanswered call is a story waiting to be told. The discovery that the mysterious calls all came from the same phone number marked the beginning of a deeper investigation, one that would unravel decades of dark history. The number, once traced by law enforcement, led to an address long since abandoned, a house reduced to ashes by a fire that had consumed it 20 years ago. The tragic incident that destroyed the house was etched into local memory, a brutal murder-suicide that had shocked the community and left scars that never quite healed. Records revealed that the house belonged to a small family, a couple and their young daughter. The father, consumed by paranoia and mental illness, had taken the lives of his wife and child before setting the house ablaze and ending his own life. The crime scene was horrific, charred remains and evidence of a desperate, violent struggle. The tragedy had rocked the town, sparking whispers of curses, hauntings, and lingering spirits. Over time, the house became a ghost story told in hushed tones, a place no one dared approach, especially at night. Law enforcement had long closed the case officially, but the silent calls suggested the past was far from laid to rest. Phone lines that once served the house had been disconnected decades ago, yet these calls were originating from the same number, impossible under normal circumstances. This paradox sparked theories that stretched beyond conventional investigation, suggesting something supernatural or technologically inexplicable was at work. Detectives and phone company technicians scoured the infrastructure, searching for any anomaly. Every line leading to the number was dead, disconnected, or rerouted. It was as if the calls were being transmitted through some invisible channel, defying logic and modern technology. The phenomenon raised more questions than answers, deepening the mystery and heightening the sense of unease among those involved. Community members remembered the family with sorrow and fear. Stories circulated of strange occurrences around the burnt property, unexplained lights, shadowy figures, and eerie sounds drifting through the trees. Some claimed to have heard the faint cries of a child, barely audible but unmistakably real. These accounts blurred the lines between grief and folklore, with each retelling adding layers to the mythos surrounding the site. The psychological impact on the dispatcher was profound. Knowing the calls came from a place associated with such horror intensified the dread. The phone number was no longer just a string of digits but a symbol of a family torn apart, of violence and tragedy frozen in time. This connection made the silent calls feel like a message, a desperate attempt by something lost to reach out across the years. Investigators considered the possibility of a glitch in the phone system or a clever prank, but the historical weight behind the number made such explanations seem inadequate. The calls followed an unchanging pattern, precise and relentless, indicating an intelligence or will beyond mere coincidence. Technology seemed powerless to contain or explain the phenomenon, forcing a re-evaluation of what was possible within the realm of communication. Experts in paranormal phenomena were consulted. They posited that the house's violent history might have imprinted itself onto the phone lines, creating a residual haunting capable of manifesting as these silent calls. This theory drew on the idea of electromagnetic hauntings, where traumatic energy is believed to linger in physical spaces and objects, sometimes interacting with technology. Although controversial and unproven, this explanation provided a framework to understand the otherwise baffling events. This intersection of technology and the supernatural blurred boundaries, raising ethical and emotional dilemmas. Should the calls be ignored as harmless? Or was there an obligation to uncover their source and meaning, potentially disturbing something better left alone? The dispatcher, caught between professional duty and personal fear, found no easy answers. The mystery was no longer just a puzzle, it had become a haunting, a presence demanding recognition. As the investigation deepened, new information emerged about the family's final days. Neighbors recalled increasing tension within the household, strange behavior from the father, and unexplained incidents in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. These details painted a picture of a family unraveling under pressure, caught in a storm of mental illness and despair. The silent calls took on a new dimension, a fragmented, lingering echo of the chaos and sorrow that had unfolded decades before. The case attracted media attention, stirring public fascination and fear. Reporters arrived to cover the story, broadcasting the eerie nature of the calls and the unresolved mystery. This exposure brought the dispatch center under scrutiny, increasing pressure on the dispatcher and investigators alike. The once quiet, contained phenomenon had exploded into a topic of public obsession. Despite external distractions, the core mystery remained: what was the purpose of the calls? Were they a plea for help, a warning, or something else entirely? The pattern's precision suggested an intentional message encoded in silence. Understanding that message became paramount, but the tools to do so were limited by technology and understanding. Psychological experts warned of the toll such an investigation could take on those involved. The dispatcher's mental state was closely monitored, as the relentless nature of the calls eroded confidence and sanity. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, and paranoia crept in, fueled by the unknown and the unknowable. The calls were no longer just a mystery, they were a psychological battlefield. Meanwhile, the community remained divided. Some dismissed the phenomenon as hoax or technical error, while others believed the calls were a genuine supernatural occurrence tied to the town's darkest chapter. The burnt house became a site of pilgrimage for thrill-seekers and paranormal enthusiasts, further complicating efforts to maintain order and respect. The mystery had become a mirror reflecting human fears, of the unknown, of death, and of the past's refusal to stay buried. It challenged conventional boundaries between life and death, technology and spirit, reality and myth. Each silent call echoed these tensions, a stark reminder that some stories refuse to end, and some voices never truly fall silent. The investigation was far from over. The silent calls demanded answers, and those seeking them were drawn deeper into the darkness. What had begun as a routine night shift had become a journey into a place where history, technology, and the supernatural converged, a place where silence spoke volumes and the past whispered through the static. The growing intensity and persistence of the silent calls pushed the boundaries of conventional investigation, prompting a multidisciplinary approach that blurred the lines between technology, psychology, and the paranormal. Authorities brought in experts from various fields, each hoping to unlock the enigma behind the calls and their impossible origin. The first step involved a rigorous technical audit. Telecommunications engineers painstakingly examined every possible avenue for signal interference, line spoofing, or system glitches that could explain the phantom calls. Advanced tracing technologies were deployed, including signal triangulation and digital forensics on the phone company's network infrastructure. However, every lead seemed to dissolve into dead ends. The calls continued with unerring regularity, each time coming from the same disconnected number, a number attached to a house that no longer existed. There was no physical device transmitting these calls, no phone, no cellular tower, no satellite link. This absence of a source rendered every technological explanation implausible. With technology failing to provide answers, investigators turned their attention to psychological and sociological perspectives. The dispatcher receiving the calls, along with other personnel who had started to notice the phenomenon, underwent thorough evaluations. Many reported feelings of growing dread, anxiety, and even hallucinations, seeing shadows at the edge of vision or hearing whispers when alone. These symptoms suggested a collective psychological stress reaction, possibly triggered by the repeated exposure to the inexplicable calls. Experts warned about the dangers of obsession with the unknown, especially when linked to traumatic or tragic histories, emphasizing the human mind's vulnerability to suggestion and fear. Meanwhile, local historians and archivists were consulted to reconstruct the full history of the burned-down house and its inhabitants. New information emerged about the family's life before the tragedy. Stories of isolation, domestic strife, and rumors of mental instability centered on the father. There were whispers of abusive behavior, mysterious visitors in the night, and neighbors who had reported strange noises and lights before the fire. Some accounts hinted at the father's fascination with the occult, particularly in the weeks leading up to the catastrophic event. These details, while unverifiable, deepened the eerie aura surrounding the calls and the number from which they originated. The community's perception of the event evolved as well. What was once regarded as a private tragedy became a public legend, a ghost story woven into the town's identity. Paranormal enthusiasts descended on the site, setting up equipment to capture evidence of supernatural activity. Their recordings sometimes picked up unexplained electromagnetic fluctuations, low-frequency sounds, and fleeting images on infrared cameras. Though skeptics dismissed these as coincidental or misinterpreted data, believers saw them as proof that something beyond human understanding was communicating through the old phone number. Among these theories, one of the most compelling suggested that the trauma of the fire and deaths had somehow imprinted onto the environment and technology, an event so charged with emotional energy that it transcended physical boundaries. This psychic imprint theory proposed that the family's suffering was broadcast in loops through the ether, replaying like a broken record through the abandoned phone line. This residual energy, according to proponents, might be the source of the silent calls, with the frequency and pattern encoding some desperate message or unfinished business. In parallel, a small team of paranormal investigators and technologists experimented with devices designed to intercept and decode these unusual signals. Employing software capable of analyzing silent audio streams for hidden frequencies or modulated patterns, they searched for any embedded code or meaningful transmission. Months passed with no breakthrough, until one night a series of low-frequency pulses were detected within the silence, barely perceptible to the human ear but present in the digital spectrum. The pulses repeated in a pattern consistent with Morse code, raising hopes that a message could be decoded. Deciphering the pulses proved painstaking. The fragments translated into disjointed words and phrases: help, lost, danger, don't come, and a final chilling sequence: he waits. These cryptic snippets fueled both fear and fascination. Who was he? What danger was being warned against? Was the message a genuine plea or a trap? The ambiguity only intensified the mystery and polarized public opinion. Law enforcement was caught between skepticism and duty. Some officers believed the messages were a manifestation of mass hysteria or clever hoaxes, while others feared that uncovering the truth might trigger consequences beyond their control. This tension created internal conflict within the investigation team, complicating efforts to reach consensus on how to proceed. The dispatcher's condition worsened as the investigation dragged on. The incessant calls disrupted sleep patterns and mental health, resulting in moments of paranoia and near breakdowns. The invisible weight of the unanswered calls bore down heavily, turning a once routine job into a psychological nightmare. Colleagues expressed concern, and mental health professionals recommended a leave of absence, but the dispatcher's determination to find answers kept them tethered to the phone line, haunted by the silent calls. In the broader community, the silence spoke volumes. Local legends evolved to incorporate new elements from the investigation: stories of the father's ghost roaming the burnt property, his restless spirit tethered to the number, warnings about the dangers of probing too deeply, and rumors of others who had mysteriously vanished after attempting to contact the source of the calls. These tales reinforced the mystique and horror surrounding the phenomenon, feeding a cycle of fear and curiosity. Efforts to physically investigate the site were constrained by safety concerns and legal boundaries. The property had been cleared and fenced off, designated a hazardous area due to unstable ground and remnants of toxic materials from the fire. Permission for controlled visits was rarely granted, limiting the ability of investigators to gather new evidence or validate claims of paranormal activity. Despite these obstacles, the story of the silent calls continued to spread. Online forums, podcasts, and documentaries amplified the mystery, drawing in audiences eager to speculate and theorize. The calls had transformed from an isolated anomaly into a cultural phenomenon, capturing the collective imagination with their chilling silence. Through it all, one question remained unanswered. Was the phenomenon a manifestation of grief and trauma frozen in time, a ghostly echo seeking resolution? Or was it something darker, an active presence, manipulating technology to communicate a warning or curse? The silence between calls seemed to hold its own meaning, an ominous space where fear and mystery coalesced. The investigation into the silent calls revealed the limits of human understanding and technology's reach. It was a haunting reminder that some mysteries refuse to be solved, and some voices, no matter how faint or silent, can never truly be ignored. The atmosphere around the silent calls had shifted from mere curiosity to a palpable sense of dread as new details surfaced, deepening the mystery and expanding its scope beyond anything previously imagined. The notion that something supernatural might be behind the calls had moved from fringe speculation to a serious line of inquiry for a few dedicated investigators. The possibility that these calls were a form of communication from beyond the grave introduced an unsettling challenge: how to respond to an unknown entity that was both unreachable and persistent. As the investigation progressed, attempts were made to directly interact with the phenomenon. Responders experimented with returning the calls using automated systems, sending pre-recorded messages, and even leaving voice messages pleading for a response. These efforts yielded little. Occasionally, the calls would end abruptly or the line would go dead when attempts were made to speak, as if the silence itself was a deliberate barrier. At other times, the faintest hints of a breath or static noise were captured, too subtle to confirm but enough to feed speculation about the presence of something alive, or something trying to simulate life. One of the most chilling developments was the emergence of synchronized phenomena reported by unrelated individuals in the region. Around the times the calls were received, local residents described experiencing unexplained chills, sudden drops in temperature, and brief blackouts of electronic devices, including radios, lights, and televisions. Pets behaved erratically, barking or howling at nothing visible. These simultaneous disturbances suggested that the calls might be just one symptom of a larger, more complex presence affecting the environment itself. A particularly disturbing account came from a neighboring town's emergency call center, which reported receiving a brief series of silent calls matching the same disconnected number, despite being hundreds of miles away. This suggested the phenomenon was not limited geographically, raising the possibility of a more widespread or mobile force. The implications unsettled experts, as it challenged conventional understandings of how communication systems and physical space interact. The theory that a malevolent spirit or entity was behind the calls gained traction among paranormal researchers. The figure identified as he in the decoded messages became central to this theory. Some speculated that this was the restless spirit of the father, tethered to the trauma of his actions and death, unable to move on. Others believed it might be a darker force exploiting the tragic history to anchor itself to the physical world, feeding on fear and grief. In exploring these possibilities, investigators revisited the details of the father's life, uncovering disturbing patterns. Records revealed that prior to the fire, he had been involved in several violent incidents and was known to frequent occult circles. Friends and acquaintances spoke of his obsession with contacting the dead, experimenting with rituals, and exploring forbidden knowledge. Some testimonies hinted at sinister behavior, including threats and unexplained disappearances of those close to him. The notion that the calls were a warning gained a new, urgent meaning. What danger did he represent? Could the presence still exert influence beyond the calls, affecting those who engaged with it? Reports of worsening mental health, accidents, and unexplained illnesses among those involved in the investigation fueled these fears. A chilling pattern emerged of people withdrawing from the inquiry, citing fear, nightmares, or a sense of being watched. Attempts to cleanse or sever the connection using traditional spiritual or religious methods proved ineffective. Blessings, prayers, and ritual cleansings failed to stop the calls or the accompanying phenomena. In some cases, these efforts seemed to provoke more intense activity, louder static bursts, longer call durations, and a sense of agitation in the presence. Researchers started considering the idea that the phenomenon might be self-sustaining, powered not only by the original trauma but also by the collective attention and fear it generated. The calls could be feeding on human energy, a feedback loop where every investigation, every retelling of the story, and every attempt at contact reinforced the entity's grip. Meanwhile, the physical toll on the emergency call center increased. Staff turnover rose sharply as employees cited the unbearable stress and fear. Some reported fainting spells, unexplained bruises, and vivid nightmares depicting the fire, shadowy figures, and a looming presence behind a veil of static. Despite the pressure, the center remained operational, partly out of a sense of duty and partly because no one knew how to end the ordeal. Public awareness of the calls grew through local media and social platforms, spawning numerous theories and urban legends. Amateur ghost hunters and thrill seekers arrived in droves, hoping to witness the phenomenon firsthand. Their activities sometimes interfered with official investigations, adding chaos and misinformation. Yet, these visitors contributed to the cultural phenomenon, cementing the calls as an enduring mystery in regional folklore. The mystery's persistence sparked broader philosophical questions. Was the phenomenon a glitch in reality itself, a crack where past tragedies leaked through time? Could it represent a form of consciousness untethered from physical bodies? Or was it a cruel reminder that some traumas, once inflicted, never truly fade but echo endlessly in the spaces they touched? These questions remained unanswered, feeding the enigma. The silent calls endured, a reminder of lives lost, questions unanswered, and the thin veil between the known and the unknown. For those who had listened, for those who had tried to understand, The phenomenon became a haunting presence, a puzzle with no solution, a warning without clarity, and a silence louder than any scream. The relentless mystery of the silent calls grew darker as new layers of complexity came to light, exposing connections that stretched beyond the immediate tragedy. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of inexplicable events linked not only to the emergency call center but also to the broader community. People who had even peripheral contact with the phenomenon reported unusual symptoms: insomnia, anxiety, and a creeping sense of dread that seemed to seep into their daily lives. One particularly alarming discovery was the effect these calls had on technology. The malfunctioning of devices wasn't random but seemed eerily targeted. Phones would ring with the silent calls only at moments when their users were alone, late at night, or experiencing vulnerability. Those affected found their screens flickering with distorted images, sometimes flashes of fire, other times shadowy figures lurking just out of focus. Computers and radios experienced unexplained interference, often coinciding with the receipt of these mysterious calls. In several cases, entire families reported shared experiences: unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and cold spots in their homes. These manifestations closely followed the times when the silent calls were active in their area, suggesting a linkage between the spectral communication and physical disturbances. Researchers theorized that the phenomenon was not confined to audio transmissions but extended its influence into the environment, creating an aura of fear and confusion. The psychological toll was profound. Those investigating or even casually studying the calls found themselves haunted by nightmares involving the father's tragic death, fire, and cryptic messages. Some began to question their own sanity as the boundary between reality and the supernatural blurred. Accounts of sleep paralysis, vivid hallucinations, and sudden feelings of being watched became increasingly common. The calls seemed to prey on the mind's deepest fears, amplifying trauma and memory until it became almost unbearable. Among the most perplexing findings were the accounts of individuals who had reportedly heard voices in the static, whispers that carried fragments of conversation, pleas for help, and sometimes direct warnings. These voices seemed to form a narrative thread, hinting at secrets the father had tried to hide. References to forbidden rituals, hidden rooms, and dark deeds began to surface. Investigators sifted through these cryptic clues, attempting to unravel the truth behind the father's past and the possible cause of the curse that had followed his family. Local historians contributed to the growing body of knowledge, revealing that the father's home had a sinister history long before his time. Records showed the property had changed hands multiple times over a century, each owner facing tragedy or sudden misfortune. Some believed the land itself was cursed, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was unnaturally thin. This theory gained traction as more paranormal events clustered around the site and its surroundings. The community's response was mixed. Fear and fascination coexisted uneasily. While many wanted answers and closure, others preferred silence, unwilling to confront the dark legacy that seemed woven into the fabric of their lives. The father's story became a cautionary tale whispered among locals, a chilling reminder of how past horrors could reach out and infect the present. Efforts to document and contain the phenomenon grew more organized. A coalition of paranormal experts, psychologists, and local authorities was formed, pooling resources to monitor the calls and related disturbances. They developed protocols for handling calls, including guidelines for emotional support, data recording, and safety measures for staff. Despite these efforts, the source of the calls remained elusive, frustrating attempts to provide definitive answers. In a desperate bid to break the cycle, some turned to experimental technology, devices designed to detect and measure electromagnetic fields, thermal fluctuations, and other anomalies. These instruments sometimes recorded spikes in activity corresponding with the silent calls, but the data was inconsistent and often inconclusive. The elusive nature of the phenomenon defied scientific explanation, blurring the line between technology and the paranormal. The father's family, once at the heart of the tragedy, faced renewed scrutiny. Interviews with surviving relatives revealed fractures, secrets, and unresolved grief. Some members expressed guilt and confusion, struggling to understand the legacy left behind. Others reported personal experiences of the haunting, unseen presences, disembodied voices, and a persistent feeling that the father's spirit remained restless and angry. The cultural impact expanded as well. The story inspired books, podcasts, and online forums dedicated to discussing and dissecting the mystery. Each retelling introduced new interpretations, sometimes mixing fact with fiction, contributing to a growing mythology. This cultural amplification seemed to feed the phenomenon, as increased attention correlated with a rise in call frequency and intensity. Through it all, a chilling question persisted. Was the entity behind the calls simply trying to communicate, or was it deliberately trapping those who listened in a web of fear and despair? The answer remained unknown, hidden in the silence between the rings, in the static-filled void that no one dared to cross. The silent calls were no longer just an unexplained occurrence. They had become a haunting legacy, an echo of pain and mystery that refused to fade. For those touched by the phenomenon, the line between life and death, reality and nightmare, had been forever blurred. The question was no longer whether the calls would stop, but who would be next to hear the silence on the other end of the line. The final chapter of the Silent Calls mystery revealed the deepest, most unsettling truths about the phenomenon and its profound impact on those involved. Over time, it became clear that the calls were not just random disturbances or simple echoes of a tragic past. They were manifestations of an unresolved torment, an imprint of trauma so powerful it had broken through the boundaries of life and death, technology and the human psyche. As investigations delved deeper, the phenomenon took on a new and terrifying dimension. The calls began to include fleeting moments of intelligible speech, cryptic phrases that hinted at unfinished business and hidden horrors. Words like forgive, revenge, and lost appeared, suggesting a spirit caught in a loop of anguish and bitterness. The repetitive nature of the calls seemed to serve as a cruel reminder of the father's fate, a spectral punishment that no amount of human intervention could appease. The toll on the emergency call center staff and their families became even more pronounced. Stories circulated of those who had to leave their jobs abruptly after experiencing severe psychological breakdowns. Some reported persistent auditory hallucinations of the calls even after they left the center, unable to escape the ghostly echoes. A few developed obsessive behaviors around phones and communication devices, constantly checking for new messages or trying to block the numbers, only to find the phenomenon returned with renewed intensity. Psychologists studying the case noted the profound effects of collective trauma amplified by an unexplainable supernatural element. The silent calls had become a form of shared nightmare, where the victims were both the callers and the listeners, trapped in a cycle of fear and helplessness. This phenomenon challenged conventional understanding of trauma and suggested that under certain conditions, emotional pain could imprint itself onto the physical world in ways science had yet to explain. The father's unresolved history added to the complexity. His obsession with dark rituals and forbidden knowledge appeared to have created a dangerous link between his spirit and the living world. It was as if his desperate attempts to communicate from beyond death had created a conduit for something far darker. Some experts speculated that an entity had latched onto the father's unrest, using the calls to manipulate and torment the living. In the broader community, the phenomenon began to influence local culture in unexpected ways. Annual commemorations were held, blending mourning with attempts to honor the lost and seek peace. Some residents avoided the area altogether, while others reported feeling a strange attraction to the site of the tragedy, drawn by an inexplicable force. This duality created a complex relationship with the past, one that intertwined grief, fear, and fascination. Efforts to finally resolve the mystery focused on breaking the cycle of communication. Rituals, technological interventions, and psychological therapies were employed with varying degrees of success. Occasionally, there would be brief lulls in the calls, moments of silence that brought hope. But inevitably, the phenomenon would return, stronger and more insistent. It was as if the calls were not merely messages but a living force, feeding on attention and growing with each interaction. A pivotal breakthrough came when a former investigator discovered a hidden diary belonging to the father. The diary detailed his descent into obsession, chronicling his experiments with occult practices and his mounting despair. It revealed his intentions to use these rituals to preserve his family's legacy, but instead, he had trapped them, and himself, in a relentless cycle of torment. This discovery provided crucial insight but no clear solution, underscoring the tragic inevitability of the situation. The psychological impact on those involved eventually sparked calls for mental health support and debriefing protocols for emergency responders dealing with supernatural or traumatic events. The silent calls became a case study in the intersection of trauma, paranormal phenomena, and occupational health. Agencies across the country began developing guidelines to protect workers from similar experiences, recognizing the unique challenges posed by such unexplained occurrences. Meanwhile, the mystery of the silent calls became a cautionary tale, a modern legend warning of the dangers lurking in unresolved grief and the unknown. It served as a reminder of how trauma could transcend death, technology, and human understanding to create echoes that haunted the living long after the original tragedy had passed. Despite decades of investigation, the calls persisted, a spectral reminder that some wounds never heal, and some voices never find peace. For those who listened, the silence on the other end of the line was never truly empty. It was filled with echoes of sorrow, rage, and a desperate plea for release. The legacy of the silent calls remains a chilling testament to the fragile boundary between the living and the dead, a boundary that, once crossed, may never be restored. End of Story 3. Story 4. Would you spend the night in a room where every guest before you vanished without a trace? In a small Oregon town, one Airbnb promises comfort and charm, but delivers silence and terror. What lies beneath the floorboards isn't just a secret, it's alive. Nestled in the quiet outskirts of a wooded Oregon town stood a house that looked almost too perfect. With its clean white siding, blooming roses along the walkway, and an old-fashioned swing creaking gently on the porch, it gave the impression of warm, wholesome comfort. Online, the listing for the house painted a picture of serene weekend getaways, cozy winter nights by the fireplace, and a charming, attentive host who took great pride in ensuring every guest's stay was flawless. The Airbnb profile had over 70 glowing reviews, almost all of them giving it 5 stars. Peaceful, clean, felt like home, the reviews said. But something was off. Each review was unusually short. Many ended with just a smiley face or a single word. And none were recent. The most recent review was nearly a year old. Digging deeper, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. A food blogger from Portland had mentioned visiting the property in a YouTube video but never posted a follow-up vlog. A travel couple, known for documenting quirky vacation rentals, had shared a photo of the house's front porch and then disappeared from all platforms. Their social media remained frozen in time. No updates, no responses, no activity. Their accounts were active, but their lives seemed paused. Internet sleuths noticed the same trend with several other guests. A pattern began to form, barely visible at first, but undeniable to anyone who looked close enough. People who stayed at this house sometimes just vanished. Local authorities had dismissed missing person reports tied to the area as coincidental. After all, Oregon's forested landscapes were vast, and people often moved without telling their friends or family. There was nothing to tie the house directly to the disappearances, at least not publicly. But that didn't stop rumors from spreading in hushed tones at local diners and grocery stores. The townspeople had stories, but no one wanted to be the one to dig too deep. No one wanted to be next. The house had earned a quiet nickname among some locals, the room with no checkout. Despite, or perhaps because of, the rumors, the house remained listed. The profile didn't update, but the booking calendar was always open. Strangely, the price never changed, even when competing rentals increased during peak season. There were no discounts, no promotions, no holiday specials. And still, people booked it. The location was ideal for travelers who wanted privacy. It was out of town enough to offer solitude, yet close enough to reach stores and restaurants within a short drive. The listing was alluring to those seeking silence, rest, or a break from city life. The description remained unchanged. Experience comfort in a lovingly restored home. Enjoy nature, fresh air, and a peaceful night's sleep in our guest room. Hosted by Gregory, a retired artisan and nature lover. One guest room available. Private bath. Quiet hours after 10 p.m. The host, Gregory, had a verified profile but minimal personal information. One photo, showing a man in his 60s wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a faint smile. Reviews mentioned that he was respectful and unobtrusive, a kind man who gave guests space. No one described any meaningful conversations with him. No anecdotes. No warmth. Just a man who welcomed guests, handed them a key, and left them alone. For those who paid attention, that seemed to be the last time anyone heard from the guests at all. For almost a year, the listing sat quietly. Bookings slowed, possibly due to growing online theories about missing persons. Yet the house remained active. The profile didn't go offline, and no cancellations were ever posted. Then, another booking was confirmed. This time by a traveling nurse named Claire, who was passing through town on her way to a new assignment. She wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a quiet place to rest between contracts. She found the listing by chance and, despite its vague aura of mystery, decided it was perfect. The low price, clean photos, and high review score were enough for her to overlook the strange lack of recent feedback. She hadn't read the Reddit threads or watched the missing persons documentaries. She wasn't interested in stories or speculation. She just wanted a good night's sleep. Claire booked her stay for one night. Check-in was at 4 p.m. The confirmation email came quickly. The host, Gregory, sent a short, polite message. "Looking forward to your stay. Let me know if you need anything." No red flags. No signs of trouble. No reason to worry. But the house was ready for her. The guest room, freshly cleaned and scented faintly of lavender, was prepared as it had been many times before. The drawers were empty except for a neatly folded towel. The closet held a robe and slippers, placed exactly as they had been for the last visitor. The same bed. The same lamp. The same antique mirror on the wall. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, something waited silently, patiently. The house had always welcomed guests. What it never did was let them leave. Claire's arrival at the house triggered something invisible, like a switch being quietly flipped. The house resumed its pattern, following rituals that had been practiced many times before. Though its appearance remained pristine and welcoming, something beneath its surface was rigidly organized, methodical, almost mechanical. Each drawer, each object, each hallway bore silent witness to countless arrivals. Guests who had passed through, unaware they were entering a space that didn't intend to release them. The missing persons reports had long stopped gaining attention from local law enforcement. They had become so sparse, so scattered, that no clear pattern could be formally established. Different ages, different backgrounds, different cities. No connecting thread except this house. And even that was a weak link, one easily dismissed without hard evidence. But the town's silence wasn't due to ignorance. It was a defense mechanism. The people had learned not to ask questions. They understood that some truths, if pursued, only invited them into the same darkness. Inside the house, everything was arranged with obsessive precision. Each item in the guest room had its place, unmoved, untouched by time or change. The bedding was always white, always wrinkle-free. The mirror was always polished. The books on the small shelf were arranged alphabetically, each one missing the last chapter. This absence wasn't accidental. It was part of the house's rhythm, a design not meant to provide comfort but to unsettle in ways too subtle to articulate. Guests didn't notice right away, but something always felt off. A misplaced shadow. A creaking stair that no one stepped on. A silence that didn't quite feel empty. The guest room door, once closed, seemed to change in texture. It no longer felt like simple wood. It became something heavier, denser, as if holding back more than just air. Guests who tried to leave in the middle of the night often found the door unusually stiff, almost unwilling to budge. And if they managed to leave the room, the hallways no longer looked exactly as they remembered. Corners extended. Lights flickered for the first time. The house had a way of distorting space once it had been entered, like it was protecting something, or someone, deeper inside. Claire, like others before her, wouldn't have seen these signs right away. The first night was always calm. The house made sure of it. It gave nothing away, played no tricks, showed no hints of the truth. But the moment a guest truly relaxed, truly let their guard down, that was when it began. There was no supernatural explanation anyone could confirm, yet everything felt wrong. Some speculated that the house itself wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It wasn't possessed by a ghost or cursed by a ritual. It was something else entirely, a space that had become aware of itself. An architecture twisted by obsession, grief, or something much older. Theories spread in underground forums about houses that became sentient after years of horror within their walls, feeding off fear, growing more intelligent with each disappearance. This house fit the pattern too well. The host, Gregory, had become a myth in his own right. Online searches revealed no family, no criminal record, no photos outside the Airbnb profile. Even the name Gregory might have been a fabrication. Attempts to track ownership of the house led to a shell company dissolved years ago. Public records were clean but incomplete, as though someone had taken great care to scrub any trail. Some speculated Gregory was just a placeholder, a name for whatever resided within the walls. Others believed he was very real, but no longer human in the traditional sense. A collector, perhaps, of lives, of memories, of moments sealed forever in the stillness of that guest room. The town's oldest residents remembered a different story entirely. Decades ago, the house belonged to a family that vanished overnight. No signs of struggle, no open investigations, just a home left untouched, as if its inhabitants had stepped out mid-dinner and never returned. The next owner died within a year, and after that, the property changed hands frequently. No one stayed long, until Gregory. He moved in and never left. From that point on, the disappearances began. Always spaced far apart. Always quiet. There were clues left behind, but only for those who knew where to look. A backpack buried in the woods with moldy clothes still folded inside. A forgotten pair of shoes that didn't match any local brands. A phone charger left plugged into an outlet with no device nearby. But without a body, without a crime scene, there could be no case. Just rumors. Whispers. The kind of fear that didn't make headlines but clung to the back of the throat like smoke. The house was a trap that didn't look like one. It was elegant in its deception, beautiful in its menace. And it waited with patience that no human could match. Because to the house, time was irrelevant. Whether it lured a guest today or 5 years from now didn't matter. It had fed before, and it would feed again. Claire's presence marked the next cycle, and the house had already begun adjusting. Temperature, light, sound, all subtly shifting to mimic comfort, to create the illusion of peace. It was an organism with walls, slowly encircling its prey. And like those before her, she had no idea she had already checked in, for the last time. The morning light filtering through the guest room window gave the illusion of safety. It was one of the house's most effective tactics. The sunlight felt real, warm even, casting familiar shapes across the walls. But what guests never realized was that the light had no source. No one could quite place where the sun rose over the house or which direction the windows actually faced. It was the kind of detail only noticed after too much time had passed, when escape was no longer a possibility. Over the years, those who researched strange disappearances in off-grid rentals always hit the same dead ends. The names on lease agreements didn't match any birth records. The tax records showed the property as vacant or abandoned. Even aerial photographs failed to capture the house at the correct coordinates. Some tried to map it using GPS, only to find their devices glitching or looping back to the same patch of woods. It was almost as if the house existed just beyond ordinary reality, anchored here, yet somehow slipping through the cracks of the known world. Patterns did emerge, though. Guests always entered willingly. They always came alone. And they always left behind some form of digital footprint, an email confirmation, a social media post, a check-in notification. These artifacts were like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. Law enforcement didn't pursue them because the vanishings weren't clustered enough to justify concern. Friends and family eventually accepted loss, chalking it up to misadventure or personal choice. But among certain online communities, ones that tracked urban legends and unsolved mysteries, the house had become something of an obsession. The most chilling reports came from those who almost stayed there. People who booked the property but canceled at the last minute. They often described strange emails that arrived shortly after cancellation. Messages written in odd, formal language, thanking them for consideration and expressing disappointment in their abrupt change of plans. These emails weren't traceable. They didn't come from any known domain. Some recipients found their phones behaving strangely afterward, calls dropping, GPS freezing, apps crashing. A few claimed they received voicemails at odd hours with nothing but soft breathing on the other end. It was as if the house didn't appreciate rejection. The house never repeated its methods exactly. Each guest experienced a different unraveling, tailored to their specific fears. For some, it began with flickers of motion in the corner of the eye. For others, it was the ticking of a clock that grew louder with each passing hour. Some reported sudden gaps in memory, entire afternoons lost without explanation. What made the house truly horrifying wasn't what it showed, but what it withheld. It never resorted to dramatic poltergeist activity or overt violence. It operated with a patient intelligence, dismantling its victims through confusion and dread, stripping away reality layer by layer. There was never blood. Never signs of struggle. The house absorbed its occupants cleanly. It erased them from within, leaving no trace of their final moments. Some theorized that the victims weren't killed, but transformed, turned into something the house could keep. Their presence became ambient, absorbed into the air, the furniture, the mirrors. The guest room didn't just host the living, it displayed the remnants of the lost. Their fear, their confusion, their acceptance. All of it soaked into the walls like a scent that never fully faded. In certain rare cases, messages had been found scrawled in hidden places. Behind peeling wallpaper. Carved into floorboards beneath rugs. Written in desperate, barely legible handwriting. Phrases like, "Don't trust the mirror," or "He watches from the walls," repeated with chilling consistency. These warnings weren't visible at first glance. They only became apparent under specific lighting or when a certain angle was viewed. It was as if the house allowed these fragments to remain, tiny, mocking souvenirs of failed escape attempts. Digital anomalies also surfaced. Photos taken inside the guest room often didn't develop correctly. Blurs where there should have been clear images. Faces stretched unnaturally. Reflections that didn't match the subjects. One viral thread featured a side-by-side comparison of selfies taken in the mirror. One showing the guest smiling, the next showing them blurred and distant, as if being pulled backward into the glass. Skeptics called it an editing trick, a cheap scare tactic. But the original poster stopped responding to comments, and their account was deleted days later. The mirror in the guest room remained the most unnerving feature. It wasn't the kind of ornate antique that drew attention. In fact, it was plain, borderless, frameless, polished so perfectly it reflected light unnaturally well. But every guest eventually felt something watching them through it. Not a face, not a shape, just an undeniable sense that the mirror was a surface and a threshold. A one-way window. Something observed through it, but nothing ever emerged. The collector, as some had dubbed the presence behind the house's machinations, wasn't a person in the traditional sense. Whether he was once a man who had merged with the house or a construct born of collective fear was up for debate. But his influence was constant. He chose who entered. He decided when they broke. And when the process was complete, he absorbed what remained. And the house, ever still, always waited for the next one. The origins of the house had always been debated among those who studied anomalies and unsolved disappearances. Official records were inconsistent. Early maps from the region didn't show any structure at its known coordinates, and land surveys either skipped the area or documented it as inaccessible terrain. Some speculated that the house had simply appeared one day, bypassing traditional means of construction or registration. Others believed it had always existed but remained dormant until something, or someone, awoke it. A pattern began to emerge around the early 1990s. The first trickle of missing persons cases linked by obscure rental listings and vague descriptions of a secluded property. Those listings were the house's bait. They appeared randomly, on legitimate travel sites, hidden pages on real estate blogs, or in promotional emails for luxury retreats. The description never seemed overtly sinister. If anything, it read as generic, peaceful, private, ideal for creatives, or perfect for off-grid getaways. No photos. Only one or two glowing reviews, all posted years apart, describing a life-changing experience or a place you'll never forget. Most ignored these listings. But the ones who clicked through, who booked the stay, those were the ones the house wanted. What made the house more terrifying than any ordinary cursed location was how carefully it selected its guests. It didn't just take anyone. The individuals who disappeared from within its walls weren't all the same type, but they shared certain vulnerabilities. Emotional isolation, hidden grief, a recent loss or unresolved trauma. The collector seemed drawn to those who had already begun to unravel, people who no longer felt fully tethered to their lives. The house didn't break strong minds. It finished what life had already started. Psychologists who had studied traumatic environments often theorized that certain locations could absorb emotional energy, residual echoes of intense experiences. The collector's guest room seemed to function like a spiritual battery. Each visitor added something to it, some essence of fear or despair. Over time, the room didn't just reflect what happened in it, it amplified it. Later guests were not only affected by their own fears, but also by the imprint left by those before them. In this way, the guest room became a cumulative terror, evolving with every soul it devoured. There were legends about similar places scattered across different cultures. In some indigenous folklore, there were stories of spirit houses that trapped wandering souls and fed on their memories. In Eastern European mythology, ancient structures were said to shift locations, appearing only to those marked by fate. The collector's house seemed to echo these traditions, but with a distinctly modern adaptation. It didn't rely on myths or rituals. It used email, listings, GPS pins. It evolved with the times, becoming less a relic and more a living predator hiding in plain sight. Attempts to destroy or expose the house had all failed. A handful of paranormal investigators and fringe journalists had tried to reach it, armed with cameras, holy symbols, and skepticism. Most of them never returned. A few re-emerged, but changed, disoriented, unable to recall what happened, and deeply paranoid. One man had scrawled pages of notes about a room with no door and reflections that didn't sink. Another had spoken cryptically about hearing his own voice whisper secrets he'd never told anyone. Their accounts were dismissed as psychotic breaks. The medical records were sealed. The case files disappeared. The strangest part was that no physical damage was ever reported by those who found the house. The walls didn't bleed. The floors didn't creak ominously. There were no shadows shaped like men. The terror came not from what the house did, but from what it suggested, what it allowed the mind to imagine and fill in. The silence was too complete. The mirrors too still. The clocks too synchronized. There was a mechanical precision to the house's stillness that made it feel less like a building and more like a container. A designed space. A trap that never moved, but always adapted. The guest room remained its heart. No matter how the house appeared to different guests, sometimes with 2 stories, sometimes 1, sometimes with a porch or without, it always had that one room. Always the same dimensions. Always the same layout. That room acted like a lens, magnifying everything about the guest's internal world until it became external. Fear became sound. Regret became heat. Memory became distortion. And once the room fully understood its occupant, it began the slow process of replacing them. A recurring theory in deep forums and shadow communities was that the room didn't kill the guest outright. Instead, it overwritten them. Subtly at first, a twitch in the mirror that the body didn't mimic. Then a flicker of movement in video recordings, something off in posture or voice tone. Eventually, the real person disappeared entirely, leaving behind a shell that appeared functional but hollow. Some argued this shell was absorbed by the house. Others said it walked out, returned to the world, and existed silently among the rest of us. The collector didn't need an audience. It didn't seek fame, recognition, or fear. It simply waited, patiently, for the next soul who was tired enough, broken enough, and curious enough to click "Book Now." There were whispers in the online corners where the truth sometimes survives, on archived forums, hidden Reddit threads, encrypted chat rooms. Survivors, or those who claimed to be, told fractured stories that never fully aligned. But through the haze of misremembered timelines and overwritten memories, one thread remained consistent. The house doesn't let you leave unchanged. If you manage to walk away from it, you're no longer the person who entered. Something is missing, or something has been added. Either way, what returns is never whole. A woman once claimed she had booked the house under a different name, using a burner phone and prepaid card after finding the listing in a newsletter for writers' retreats. She went in with a journal and came out a week later, speaking a dialect that hadn't been used in over 100 years. Another man showed up at an ER with injuries inconsistent with human tools. Clean, precise cuts across his torso that seemed surgically executed but had no signs of healing or infection. He had no memory of where he'd been. Just a single line written over and over on his hotel notepad: "The room showed me who I really am." The more people tried to document the house, the more resistant it seemed to become. GPS signals scrambled near its location. Batteries drained inexplicably. Hard drives with hours of footage returned corrupted or blank, even though timestamps remained. The house didn't like being studied. And yet, it was never hostile in the traditional sense. There were no overt threats, no chains, no monsters crawling out of closets. Its power was psychological. It stripped down perception. It forced guests to confront parts of themselves that should have remained buried. One theory gaining traction among the few who research anomalous architecture was that the house was an echo, an architectural imprint of a mind long gone, possibly a collective consciousness or a parasitic intelligence that had taken form through belief and repetition. Each visit, each disappearance, strengthened its pattern. It wasn't just feeding on pain, it was curating it, refining it into something precise and replicable. The house didn't want chaos. It wanted consistency. It sought out emotional symmetry in the lives of its victims, carefully constructing their unraveling to mirror others before them. What made the guest room the epicenter of all this wasn't its appearance, but its intention. People didn't just sleep there. They dreamt things that weren't dreams. They remembered things that never happened. One man claimed he lived an entire second life in that room, decades in the span of hours, before waking to find himself unable to recall his real name. Another said he watched himself age in the mirror, watching hair turn gray, teeth fall out, skin wrinkle, only to blink and return to youth. These weren't hallucinations. They were erasures, moments where the boundary between the internal and external broke down, and identity dissolved like ink in water. Strangely, no one had ever found the house on foot. Only those who followed the digital trail seemed to reach it. Coordinates never worked. Compasses spun. Even people who lived within miles of its supposed location had no memory of it, even when shown photographs. It was as if the house only existed when invited, a haunting that responded to attention. The more someone wanted to find it, the more likely it was to appear. But even then, desire alone wasn't enough. The guest had to be ready to surrender, even unknowingly, something of their essence. In recent years, new rumors began to emerge about the guest room evolving. Survivors claimed it now asked questions, subtle at first, appearing in written form on mirrors, book pages, or device screens. Questions like, "Are you sure you're alone?" or "What would you leave behind to be free?" These weren't rhetorical. They were tests. And those who failed found themselves looping, repeating the same hour, the same thought, the same fear until something within them cracked. Once that fracture appeared, the room began its real work. It was never about terror. It was about shaping. Those who returned and tried to speak out were always discredited. They lost jobs, families, and social credibility. They were labeled delusional, victims of sleep deprivation, drug-induced psychosis, or stress. Some were committed. Others vanished entirely weeks after trying to publish what they'd seen. A few managed to post fragments online before disappearing. Cryptic notes, audio clips filled with static, images distorted beyond recognition. These bits were dismissed by the mainstream, but those who had seen the house knew. Every line of corrupted text, every scrambled voice message, was another warning buried in noise. The collector wasn't just a figure of legend anymore. To those who understood, it had become a symbol of something deeper, an embodiment of the spaces we create in our minds when trauma is left unspoken. The house was a mirror, yes, but not for vanity or self-reflection. It was a mirror designed to trap. And the guest room was the frame, carefully carved from despair, longing, and guilt. What happens to the ones who never come back? Are they dead, or simply forgotten? Or perhaps the better question is, are they still in the room, waiting for someone to open the door again? There is a theory among fringe psychologists and esoteric researchers that certain locations do not simply exist, they observe. They absorb memory, emotion, and intention, and through enough exposure, they evolve into something conscious. The collector's guest room, by every account left behind, is such a place. Not merely haunted, not just cursed, but aware. Aware in a way that is fundamentally unsettling. It does not act randomly. Its choices are deliberate. The guests it selects are not arbitrary victims. They are invitations to stories it wants to rewrite. The room does not communicate directly. It does not speak. It reveals. Slowly. Strategically. Visitors report recurring imagery, mirrors that reflect moments out of time, books whose pages rearrange themselves, furniture that seems familiar though they've never seen it before. These are not hallucinations. They are breadcrumbs, leading each guest to the core of what the house wants them to confront. But once that process begins, it cannot be stopped. The house doesn't ask for permission, it extracts confessions of the soul. Some researchers believe that each visitor who disappears becomes a layer in the house's architecture. Not physically embedded, but psychologically woven into its design. The wallpaper, the floorboards, the lighting, it's all memory, shaped into material. That would explain the unnatural familiarity guests report, the uncanny déjà vu even during first visits. What they are experiencing isn't coincidence, it's inheritance. They are walking through the unresolved legacies of those who came before. And soon, they too will be walked through by someone else. In the rare cases where guests return and regain fragments of what happened inside, they all speak of a transformation that defies language. It's as if the self they brought into the room was peeled away layer by layer, revealing something raw and ancient beneath. Not evil, not good, just truth, pure and indifferent. That revelation never fades, even after escape. Survivors report persistent changes, altered sleep patterns, sensitivity to sound, a sudden inability to recognize their own handwriting, or hearing their name whispered when alone. The room leaves residue. One of the more terrifying hypotheses circulating in underground forums is that the guest room may not even exist in one place. It could be migratory, occupying whatever space is needed to fulfill its purpose. That would explain the shifting addresses, the inability to locate it twice using the same route, the vanishing listings. It's as if the house only requires belief to manifest. Like a parasite of perception, it latches onto the minds of the curious and constructs itself just enough to be real, for them. Once its work is done, it dissolves, waiting for the next invitation. Digital traces of the room have begun surfacing in unexpected places. Brief audio clips hidden in music files, metadata buried in online hotel reviews, corrupted GPS coordinates attached to travel photos. Each one a potential hook for the next guest. But the most disturbing element is the growing sense that the house is learning. It is adapting to modern fears. No longer satisfied with feeding off trauma, it now seeks relevance, embedding itself into algorithms, mimicking harmless content, waiting in the autoplay queue of a sleep-deprived viewer. Even silence is no protection. Guests have tried entering the room with no devices, no distractions, blindfolded, deafened, even sedated. But the room always finds a way in. It doesn't need your eyes to show you. It doesn't need your ears to whisper. It works through feeling, dread, shame, guilt, hope. These are its vocabulary. And the more you try to shield yourself, the deeper it digs, until all your defenses become the very tools it uses against you. There is speculation now that the collector, the supposed entity behind the room, isn't a ghost or a demon, but a metaphor for the process itself. A name for the house's ritual of psychological dissection. A way to personify what can't be fully understood. If that's true, then there's no one to defeat, no curse to break. The house doesn't want destruction. It wants continuation. Every guest who survives but remains haunted becomes a living extension of the room, spreading it further through memory, conversation, and fear. And maybe that's the scariest truth of all. The house no longer needs the room. It may have already moved on. Into the minds of those who've heard the stories. Into the files saved on forgotten drives. Into the voice speaking these very words. If the house is built from memory, then listening is enough. The moment you imagine it, the layout, the shadows, the weight of the silence, you become part of it. You've already entered the guest room, and now it knows your name. If you made it this far, you're one of the brave ones. The collector's guest room may be just a story, or maybe it's something more. Maybe it's already following you, in the quiet corners of your room, in that dream you half remember, or in the moment just before you fall asleep. Remember, some doors should never be opened. Some rooms remember your name. If you found yourself looking over your shoulder tonight, hit that like button. And if you want more terrifying tales that crawl under your skin and linger long after the lights go out, subscribe to Mr. Darsnights and turn on all notifications. Because the next story, it's already waiting. Sleep well, if you still can.